Welcome to History Teller YT, your gateway to the untold stories, the forgotten tribes, and the rich legacies that have shaped the Philippines over thousands of years. Today, we embark on a remarkable journey to explore the deep and diverse history of Mindanao, long before the arrival of Islam in the 14th century and Christianity in the 16th century. This is a story of resilience, culture, trade, and the unwavering spirit of the first custodians of this island, the Subanen people. Before foreign influence touched the islands, the Subanen had already established thriving communities along river valleys and highland mountains, developing a rich culture, spiritual system, and economic network that connected them with neighboring civilizations, including China and Borneo. As we navigate this history, you will discover their stone tools, burial jars, shell ornaments, and gold artifacts, each piece telling a story of ingenuity, long-distance trade, and cultural sophistication. You will learn how their leadership structures, communal land ownership, and spiritual beliefs provided the foundation for a society that valued harmony, cooperation, and respect for nature. We will explore the rise of regional powers, such as the Kingdom of Butuan, the Sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao, and the ongoing trade networks that connected Mindanao to the wider world. You will witness how the Subanen maintained their independence, practicing animistic religion and communal law, even as Islam spread to neighboring regions and Spanish and later American colonial powers attempted to exert control. From the early Indigenous Era through the 19th century, you will see how they adapted to shifting political, economic, and social pressures without losing their identity, demonstrating a level of resilience that still inspires today. In this video, we will follow the Subanen's journey through the post-war Reconstruction era, integration into the modern Philippine nation, and their ongoing efforts to preserve language, culture, and ancestral lands in the 20th and 21st centuries. You will understand why it is a misconception that Mindanao was historically all Muslim, and how the Subanen, along with other Lumad tribes, contributed to the island's rich cultural mosaic. By the end of this story, you will gain a deeper appreciation of the layers of history, the sacrifices, and the enduring legacy of these first custodians, whose traditions, governance, and ecological knowledge continue to inform and inspire generations. So, sit back, immerse yourself, and allow yourself to be transported across centuries of time. Let History Teller YT guide you through rivers, mountains, marketplaces, and ancestral villages as we uncover a history that is complex, inspiring, and profoundly human. From ancient origins to contemporary struggles and triumphs. This is a story that deserves to be heard in full. Stay with us until the end, as every chapter reveals a new layer of Mindanao's fascinating past, and every detail contributes to the full picture of the Subanen's remarkable journey. Prepare to embark on this epic journey as we bring history to life, uncover forgotten stories, and connect the dots between the past and the present. By the time you finish watching, you won't just know history. You will feel it, understand it, and carry it with you as part of the living legacy of Mindanao. Long before written records, long before the arrival of foreign traders or foreign religions, Mindanao was already alive with human footsteps and thriving cultures. Archaeologists trace some of the earliest inhabitants of this island to around 500 BC, and one of the most prominent among them were the Subanen people. The very name Subanen comes from two words, Suba, meaning river, and Nin, meaning people. True to this name, they built their lives along the winding rivers and fertile valleys of Samboanga Peninsula, stretching into the mountain ranges where water, land, and forest provided everything a community needed. Imagine an early morning thousands of years ago. Villages of bamboo and nipa huts nestled beside a riverbank, children running barefoot along the shore, and hunters preparing traps in the forest while women crafted bracelets from shells and beads. Life was simple, but it was far from primitive. Archaeological evidence, discovered in caves of Zamboanga del Norte, shows how advanced and resourceful these communities were. Stone tools, skillfully shaped and polished, connect them to the late Neolithic era, around 900 to 200 BC. These were not crude rocks, but carefully designed tools used for farming, hunting, and daily life. Burial jars, both earthen and sometimes even glazed, reveal that the Subanen practiced ritual care for the dead, a sign of deep spirituality and social order. Alongside the jars, archaeologists found shell bracelets, brightly colored beads, and gold ornaments. Clear proof that these early settlers had developed craftsmanship, aesthetics, and a sense of identity that they expressed through material culture. What is even more remarkable is the discovery of Chinese ceramics from the Yuan, 1271 to 1368, and Ming, 1368 to 1644, dynasties in the same regions. These artifacts are evidence of an already thriving trade network, linking Mindanao to the wider Asian world long before Islam or Christianity reached its shores. The existence of these artifacts paints a vivid picture. The Subanen were not isolated people hidden in the mountains, but active participants in maritime trade, exchanging forest goods, gold, and pearls for foreign ceramics and beads. Long before colonial powers thought of charting these waters, Mindanao was already a player in an interconnected world. This challenges the old misconception that pre-Islamic Mindanao was uncivilized or empty. On the contrary, it was alive, organized, spiritual, and part of a network that reached as far as China. The dawn of Subanen life in Mindanao shows us that history here begins not with conquest, but with creativity, resilience, and community. To understand the ancient history of Mindanao, we must step closer into the world of the Subanen. Their way of life revolved around the cycles of nature, and unlike later systems brought by foreign rule, land was never treated as private property. Instead, it was communal, shared by the whole community for survival. A family could plant crops in a plot of land, harvest them, and then allow the soil to rest, while others would make use of nearby areas. This practice of shifting cultivation, paired with fishing, hunting, and gathering, ensured a balanced relationship with the environment. Gold mining was also part of their livelihood, and even today, traces of small-scale mining practices remain in some Subanen areas. This connection to the earth was not just economic, it was spiritual. The Subanen worshipped Diwata Migbebaya, the creator of life, and they believed spirits resided in natural elements: the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, and the rivers. Every tree, every boulder, every river bend was alive with unseen guardians. Before cutting a tree, hunters would ask permission from the spirits. Before planting, farmers would offer rituals for blessing. These beliefs formed the foundation of a culture that valued harmony with nature rather than domination over it. Unlike foreign systems of centralized kings and monarchs, Subanen leadership was guided by Timues and Datus, elders and leaders who ruled not by fear or divine right, but by wisdom, tradition, and consensus. Their society was tightly knit, built on cooperation and mutual respect. Peace pacts between villages ensured stability, and when disputes arose, they were resolved through customary law rather than violence. This form of governance, though simple, reflects principles that modern societies still strive for: justice, equality, and community over greed. Their villages were small but self-sufficient. Men hunted wild boar and deer, while women cultivated root crops like yam, taro, and rice in the uplands. Rivers provided abundant fish, while the forests offered timber, honey, and medicinal plants. Children learned skills by observing elders, inheriting not only knowledge but also values of respect, discipline, and spirituality. What truly set the Subanen apart was their ability to balance livelihood and trade. By the time foreign traders from China and Southeast Asia began arriving, the Subanen were already ready with goods to exchange: gold dust, pearls, forest products like rattan and resin. In return, they received beads, iron tools, and ceramics. These exchanges were not just economic transactions, but cultural encounters, where stories, rituals, and customs were also shared. Thus, even before the rise of Islamic sultanates and Spanish colonies, Mindanao was already a land of thriving connections, and the Subanen were at its heart. The story of Mindanao before Islam cannot be told without emphasizing the vast trade networks that linked its people to the outside world. As early as the 9th and 10th centuries, Chinese records already mentioned traders from the Philippines, and Butuan in northern Mindanao stood out as a maritime kingdom famed for its gold. The Cameo tribe of Butuan developed strong relations with Chinese merchants, sending gold, pearls, and other treasures across the seas. Meanwhile, in the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Subanen established Semboangan, today's Zamboanga City, as a bustling hub of exchange. From this port, Subanen traders connected with Chinese, Malay, and Visayan merchants. Imagine the sight: foreign ships arriving on the horizon, sails flapping in the wind, carrying ceramic jars, iron blades, silk fabrics, and colorful glass beads. On the shores, Subanen men and women awaited with baskets of rice, gold nuggets, pearl shells, and bundles of rattan. Trade was not conducted with money, but through barter, a system of trust where both sides valued each other's goods. These encounters were also cultural events. Merchants shared not only items, but also ideas, new tools, farming techniques, stories of distant lands, and even beliefs that slowly shaped the worldview of Mindanao's people. The presence of imported Chinese celadon, yuan, and Ming Dynasty ceramics in Subanen lands proves that this trade was consistent and far-reaching. But beyond the economic value, these exchanges signaled something more profound. Mindanao was never isolated. Its people were part of the same networks that shaped Southeast Asia. They were contemporaries of the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra, the Majapahit in Java, and the great trading cities of Borneo. This reality breaks the colonial myth that the Philippines had no civilization before foreign religions and powers arrived. On the contrary, Subanen and other indigenous tribes built their own worlds, rooted in spirituality, sustained by communal life, and expanded by trade. By the 12th century, the kingdom of Butuan was at its peak, even sending delegations to China, while Subanen territories remained strong in Zamboanga, guarding their independence through unity and tradition. These centuries before the arrival of Islam show a Mindanao that was already rich, dynamic, and confident in its identity. It was a land of kings, datus, timues, and communal villages, each contributing to a mosaic of culture that makes Mindanao unique to this day. By the first centuries of the Common Era, the indigenous peoples of Mindanao had already developed patterns of living that were deeply rooted in both tradition and survival. Among the Subanen and other tribes, the foundation of life was the communal village. Unlike the kingdoms that would rise later, or the centralized monarchies that existed in other parts of Southeast Asia, these early Mindanao communities thrived on a principle of equality and cooperation. The land was not owned by any single person or family. Rather, it was held collectively by the village. Families were free to cultivate a portion of the land for rice, corn, or root crops, But once the harvest was done, that land would be allowed to rest, and another family might make use of it the following year. This practice of shifting cultivation was not only an agricultural technique, it was an environmental ethic, a recognition that the earth needed to heal in order to give again. Daily life in these early centuries was simple yet highly organized. Men often hunted in the forests, bringing back wild deer, boar, or smaller animals, while women focused on farming, weaving, and pottery. Children were introduced early to the tasks of the community, learning by doing rather than through formal teaching. By observing their elders, they inherited not only practical skills, but also the values of respect for nature, hospitality, and communal unity. In the evenings, families would gather around fires, sharing food, exchanging stories, and chanting ritual songs that spoke of creation, spirits, and the ancestors who had guided them to the land they now called home. But beyond daily survival, these communities also practiced an early form of governance. Leaders called timues for the Subanen or datas in other tribes served as decision-makers and protectors. Their authority was not based on wealth or conquest, but on wisdom, fairness, and their ability to maintain peace. Disputes were settled through dialogue, often in front of the entire community, where everyone had a voice. This communal justice system meant that decisions were respected and harmony within the group was preserved. Compared to the often violent systems of rule in many early states, Mindanao's communal model was surprisingly democratic. Religion remained central in their lives. The people revered Diwata Migbebaya, the creator and sustainer of life, and believed that natural forces were inhabited by spirits. Rivers, mountains, forests, and even certain animals were seen as sacred, deserving of rituals and offerings. Before planting rice, a ritual was performed to call upon the blessing of spirits. Before a hunting expedition, prayers were offered to avoid misfortune. This spiritual worldview ensured that the people of Mindanao lived in constant awareness of their relationship with the natural and unseen worlds. Far from being primitive, this worldview allowed them to thrive in balance with their environment for centuries. As centuries passed, Mindanao did not remain isolated from the rest of the world. By around 700 AD, trade networks across Southeast Asia had begun to link communities through the exchange of goods, and Mindanao was part of this growing web. The rivers that gave life to the Subanen also served as natural highways, connecting inland villages to the coast, where larger trading ships arrived from the Visayas, Borneo, and even farther. From these exchanges, Mindanao's people obtained iron tools, beads, and pottery in exchange for gold dust, forest resins, pearls, and woven mats. The barter system was the foundation of this trade. There was no coinage, no currency to calculate values, but mutual trust was built between trading partners. For example, a bundle of resin used for boat sealing might be exchanged for a set of iron blades. A sack of rice could be traded for beads or imported pottery. These exchanges were not just about goods, they were about relationships. Trade established bonds between groups, encouraged intermarriage between tribes, and exposed communities to new ideas and customs. Through trade, the Subanen and other Mindanao tribes came to know about the existence of larger kingdoms beyond their island, such as those in Borneo, the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra, and the Visayan polities to the north. Archaeological evidence supports these interactions. Imported Chinese ceramics, including the well-known Celadon wares, began appearing in burial sites, signifying not just trade but also cultural adoption. These ceramics were highly valued, often used in rituals or reserved for community leaders. The fact that they were buried with the dead reflects how much prestige and meaning these foreign objects carried. But it was not a one-way exchange. Mindanao's gold was famous across the region. Gold dust and ornaments found their way into markets of Southeast Asia, while pearls and tortoise shells were equally sought after. These items, abundant in Mindanao, were prized luxuries elsewhere, giving the island a reputation for wealth even before the rise of Islamic sultanates or Spanish conquest. This growing network of exchanges also encouraged the development of local political structures. Leaders who managed trade became more influential, and certain areas like Butuan in northern Mindanao began to emerge as powerful trading states. Meanwhile, the Subanen and Samboanga continued to thrive in their communal villages while participating in this trade through Semboangan, their coastal hub. What is remarkable here is the ability of Mindanao's indigenous peoples to adapt and thrive while maintaining their cultural identity. They welcomed trade, but they did not abandon their animistic faith or communal land systems. This balance between tradition and exchange would become a defining feature of their resilience for centuries. The period from 100 to 900 AD was not just about farming and trade. It was also about the deepening of spiritual traditions and cultural practices that gave meaning to daily life. For the Subanen, religion was not confined to temples or formal rituals. It was woven into every aspect of existence. Their highest deity, Diwata Migbebaya, was honored as the giver of life, but everyday spirits, those who lived in rivers, mountains, and forests, were equally respected. To the Subanen, the natural world was alive with unseen forces, and their duty was to live in harmony with them. Ritual specialists, often elders or shamans, led ceremonies to ensure good harvests, safe hunts, and protection from illness. These ceremonies included chants, dances, and offerings of food, animals, or crafted objects. Storytelling was another crucial part of cultural life. Through myths and epics, elders explained the origins of the world, the creation of the first people, and the duties of humans toward the spirits. These stories also carried moral lessons about bravery, respect, and the importance of unity. In a society without writing, oral tradition was the foundation of history, law, and morality. Every child grew up hearing these tales, ensuring that values were passed down faithfully across generations. Cultural practices extended beyond rituals. The Subanen were skilled in crafting ornaments from shells and beads, weaving colorful textiles, and shaping pottery that was both functional and decorative. Music and dance were central to community gatherings. Bamboo instruments created rhythmic beats that accompanied songs of praise, sorrow, or celebration. During harvest time, villages came alive with communal feasts where everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, joined in. These feasts reinforced the bonds of kinship and reminded people that survival was always a shared effort. Another significant cultural practice was their approach to death and burial. Burial jars, sometimes decorated and sometimes plain, were used to house the remains of the deceased. Alongside these jars, families often placed personal belongings of the dead, beads, tools, or even ceramics. This reflected the belief that life continued after death and that the spirits of ancestors remained close to their descendants. Ancestors were honored and remembered in rituals, seen not as distant figures, but as active guardians of the living. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a society that, though labeled pre-Islamic or pre-Hispanic, was not lacking in complexity. It was a culture rich with symbolism, values, and traditions that gave meaning to every aspect of life. From the way they farmed the land to the way they honored their dead, the people of Mindanao in this early era had already built a civilization uniquely their own. This spiritual and cultural foundation would shape their resilience as new waves of religion and colonization began arriving centuries later. By the 10th century, Mindanao had begun to shift from small, communal villages to more complex political and economic systems. Among the most powerful symbols of this transformation was the rise of the Kingdom of Butuan, located in what is now Agusan del Norte. Archaeological discoveries, including the famed Balangay boats, provide evidence that Butuan was not just an inland community, but a major maritime center. These large wooden boats, built through advanced plank joining techniques, could carry dozens of people and heavy cargo across long distances, linking Butuan to the wider seas of Southeast Asia. Chinese historical records also confirm Butuan's importance. In the year 1001 AD, the Chinese Song dynasty recorded the arrival of a diplomatic mission from Butuan. This delegation carried gifts of native products, including gold, tortoise shells, and pearls, and in return received Chinese recognition. The fact that Butuan sent ambassadors to China demonstrates two things. First, that Mindanao was already integrated into the global system of tribute and diplomacy. And second, that Butuan was powerful enough to present itself as an organized kingdom with rulers, wealth, and ships capable of crossing the South China Sea. Butuan's wealth came primarily from gold. The rivers and mountains of northern Mindanao were rich in deposits, and skilled goldsmiths shaped these resources into ornaments, tools, and trade goods. Some of the finest pre-Hispanic gold artifacts found in the Philippines, necklaces, earrings, and ceremonial objects, originated in this kingdom. To the Chinese, Malay, and Arab traders who visited, Butuan was known as a land of wealth, where gold was so abundant that it could be used in daily transactions. This reputation helped secure its place in regional trade routes, ensuring that merchants would return again and again. The rise of Butuan also influenced neighboring tribes. Smaller communities, such as those in Surigao and the Visayas, were drawn into its orbit, either as trade partners or allies. While the Subanen of Zamboanga remained rooted in their communal systems, they too benefited from this larger wave of commerce, particularly through Zamboangan, their port settlement. Goods from Butuan often passed westward across Mindanao before making their way into the Zamboanga Peninsula, where they could be traded with Borneo and beyond. This interconnectedness highlights how Mindanao, far from being an isolated land, was already a vibrant participant in a growing global economy. Butuan's influence during this period marks the beginning of Mindanao's transformation into a region where kingdoms could rise, powered by trade and diplomacy. It also serves as proof that long before Islam or Christianity arrived, Mindanao had its own centers of power, prestige, and wealth. While Butuan flourished in the northeast, the Subanen people of the Zamboanga Peninsula carved out their own place in the trade networks of Mindanao. Their coastal hub, known as Zamboangan, the root of today's Zamboanga City, became a gathering point for traders from across the seas. Situated at a strategic location along the Sulu Sea, Zamboangan was perfectly positioned to connect Mindanao's interior resources with foreign merchants traveling between the Visayas, Borneo, and even China. The Subanen were skilled at collecting and preparing trade goods. From the mountains came gold dust, resin, and forest products like beeswax, rattan, and timber. From the coast came pearls, shell ornaments, and fish. These goods were exchanged for imported items, such as Chinese ceramics, Southeast Asian beads, and iron tools. In the barter system that dominated the era, trust and reputation mattered as much as the goods themselves. A Subanen trader who cheated his partners risked losing access to the wider network, while one who upheld honesty earned long-term relationships. The influence of Semboangan extended beyond trade. It became a cultural crossroads where languages, stories, and rituals mingled. Chinese merchants introduced ceramics that were soon incorporated into local burial practices, while Malay traders brought new weaving techniques and styles of ornamentation. Yet, despite these influences, the Subanen retained their animistic religion and communal social structures. Unlike Butuan, which developed into a centralized kingdom under the leadership of Adatu, the Subanen maintained their system of timues, leaders chosen for their wisdom and ability to uphold customary law. This difference shows the diversity of political systems that coexisted in Mindanao during this time. Semboangan also functioned as a defensive center. Located near the frontier of multiple trading routes, it was exposed to both opportunity and risk. Raids, disputes, and rivalries sometimes threatened the peace, but the Subanen responded with alliances and peace pacts that reinforced their unity. Oral traditions recall how leaders from various Subanen clans met at Semboangan to renew agreements, share news, and prepare for the coming trading season. These gatherings not only strengthened economic ties, but also reinforced a sense of identity and belonging. Through Semboangan, the Subanen became important players in regional trade without abandoning their cultural roots. Their ability to adapt to external influences while preserving their own traditions ensured their survival and prosperity during this era. The rise of kingdoms and trade hubs in Mindanao also brought changes to leadership and governance. In Butuan, Datus gained prestige not only as military leaders, but also as controllers of trade. Their authority grew with each successful voyage and each new diplomatic exchange. In contrast, the Subanen of Samboanga retained their traditional leadership system, rooted in communal law and consensus. Here, timues acted as both political and spiritual guides. They upheld customary law, ensuring that disputes were settled fairly, resources were shared properly, and rituals were observed faithfully. This period saw the development of codified traditions. Oral laws, memorized and passed down by elders, dictated how land could be used, how marriages were arranged, and how conflicts should be resolved. For example, if a dispute arose over farming land, the timue would gather the community, listen to both sides, and consult tradition before declaring a resolution. This process was not arbitrary, but rooted in centuries of collective wisdom, ensuring stability even without written codes. Religion continued to be central in shaping governance. Leaders were expected to maintain harmony not only among people, but also with the spirits. Failure to perform rituals or breaking taboos could bring misfortune on the entire village. Thus, leadership was not just political authority, it was also a sacred duty. The blending of law, spirituality, and community gave Mindanao society's resilience in the face of challenges. Despite the growing power of Butuan and the prominence of Subanen trade, much of Mindanao during this period remained animistic and outside the influence of larger religions. Islam had not yet reached its shores, and Christianity was still centuries away. This meant that the cultural systems of the indigenous tribes developed without interference from outside dogmas. The result was a uniquely local civilization, one that valued community over kingship, spirits over organized temples, and oral traditions over written texts. As the 12th century drew to a close, Mindanao stood at the threshold of change. Kingdoms like Butuan had risen to prominence, Subanen trade hubs had thrived, and indigenous law and spirituality had been firmly established. Yet, just over the horizon, new forces were preparing to enter. Forces that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of the island. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Mindanao's history. By the 13th century, Mindanao had reached a golden age of prosperity, even before the arrival of Islam in the southern islands. The centuries of trade with China, Borneo, and the Visayas had firmly established networks of wealth and exchange. Butuan, which had already been recognized by China in earlier centuries, remained a major center of gold and maritime commerce. Its balangay ships continued to dominate the waters, carrying treasures across the seas. Meanwhile, Samboanga's Semboangan flourished as the Subanen's coastal hub, serving as both a marketplace and a meeting ground for diverse cultures. The archaeological record reveals how extensive this trade was. Ceramics from both the Yuan and Ming dynasties have been found in Subanen territories, showing that goods from China continued to flow into Mindanao. These ceramics were often used in burial rituals, reflecting both their prestige and their spiritual significance. To own such items was a sign of wealth and status, and to bury them with the dead was a way of ensuring blessings in the afterlife. At the same time, the Subanen and other tribes exchanged their local products: gold, pearls, resins, timber, and woven mats. These items were in high demand in international markets, giving Mindanao a reputation as a land of wealth long before foreign conquerors arrived. The prosperity of this period was not limited to wealth. It also fostered stability and peace among many communities. Peace pacts and alliances ensured that trade routes remained open and that resources were shared fairly. In Subanen culture, communal law and the authority of the Timue remained strong. These leaders made sure that disputes were resolved quickly, preventing conflicts that could disrupt the harmony of the community. The prosperity was not built on conquest or centralization, but on cooperation, trade, and respect for tradition. What makes this period especially important is that it challenges the narrative that the Philippines was a land of small, disconnected villages before Islam and Christianity. In reality, Mindanao was already experiencing economic and cultural growth, with multiple centers of power and trade. It was a land where local traditions thrived even as external influences were absorbed. Prosperity before Islam demonstrates that the people of Mindanao were active agents in shaping their destiny, not passive recipients of foreign religions or colonial control. During this age of prosperity, religion and culture flourished as well. Animism remained the dominant faith across most of Mindanao. The Subanen continued to honor Diwata Migbebaya, the creator of life, along with numerous spirits that resided in rivers, forests, and mountains. Ritual specialists played a central role in maintaining harmony between humans and spirits, conducting ceremonies to bless harvests, ensure safe voyages, and protect the community from illness or misfortune. These rituals often included chanting, drumming, and offerings of food or crafted items, creating a communal sense of unity. Cultural practices thrived alongside trade. With the influx of foreign goods came new inspirations for local artistry. Subanen women adorned themselves with imported beads woven into intricate necklaces, while goldsmiths refined their craft, producing ornaments of breathtaking beauty. Pottery and weaving also developed further, with designs becoming more elaborate. Music and dance were central to both religious and social life. Harvest festivals brought entire villages together for feasts, dancing, and storytelling. These celebrations reinforced communal bonds and allowed everyone, from elders to children, to feel part of a larger whole. Storytelling and oral tradition continued to serve as the backbone of culture. Myths of creation, tales of ancient heroes, and epics of battles between spirits and humans were passed down across generations. These stories were more than entertainment. They were vessels of memory, law, and morality. Through them, children learned values of bravery, honesty, and respect for nature. They also connected people to their ancestors, reminding them that they were part of a lineage stretching back centuries. Despite increasing contact with foreign traders, Mindanao's indigenous communities remained firmly rooted in their traditions. While they adopted foreign objects like ceramics and beads, they did not abandon their animistic worldview or communal land practices. In this way, the period of prosperity before Islam represents a remarkable balance. Mindanao's people embraced external opportunities without losing their cultural soul. This resilience would prove vital in the centuries to come, as new religions and powers sought to reshape the island. One of the defining features of Mindanao before Islam was the way communities governed themselves and maintained peace. Unlike kingdoms that relied on strict monarchies or empires that ruled through conquest, the Subanen and other indigenous groups upheld systems rooted in customary law and consensus. Leaders, whether they were Timues or Datis, were chosen for their wisdom, fairness, and ability to maintain harmony. They were not tyrants who demanded tribute, but respected figures who guided their people through negotiation and ritual. Peace pacts played a crucial role in ensuring stability. When disputes arose between villages over land, resources, or trade routes, leaders would meet to discuss terms of peace. These agreements were sealed not only by spoken promises, but also by rituals that called upon the spirits as witnesses. Breaking a peace pact was not only a political offense, but also a spiritual crime, believed to bring misfortune upon the violator's community. This spiritual dimension gave customary law a weight that made it widely respected and followed. The system of communal land ownership also reinforced unity. Because no single individual could claim absolute ownership, the community as a whole shared responsibility for survival. Farming, fishing, and hunting were all collective efforts. When one family struggled, others helped. When a disaster struck, the entire community worked together to recover. This spirit of cooperation ensured that prosperity was shared, preventing the rise of extreme inequality. As trade expanded, leaders gained new roles as mediators between foreign merchants and local villagers. They ensured fair exchanges, protected their communities from exploitation, and sometimes even organized defensive alliances against raiders. Yet, despite the growing complexity, the essence of governance remained communal and spiritual. Leaders ruled not through force, but through respect and tradition. By the time the 14th century approached, Mindanao was a land of flourishing trade, rich culture, and strong communal governance. It was prosperous, stable, and deeply rooted in its own traditions. But this prosperity existed on the eve of great change. Over the seas, Arab traders and missionaries were preparing to introduce a new faith that would reshape parts of Mindanao forever: Islam. By the late 14th century, a new wave of visitors began to arrive in the waters of Mindanao. These were not just merchants seeking pearls, gold, and exotic forest goods. They were missionaries, scholars, and seafarers carrying a new faith: Islam. Historians widely recognize Karim al-Maktoum, an Arab trader and religious missionary, as one of the earliest to introduce Islam to the southern Philippines around the year 1380 AD. His arrival was not abrupt or forceful. Instead, it flowed naturally through the same maritime routes that had long connected Mindanao to Borneo, Malacca, and the wider Muslim world. Karim al-Maktoum and others like him combined commerce with religion. They traded textiles, ceramics, and beads in exchange for Mindanao's prized resources. But alongside these goods, they shared stories of the Prophet Muhammad, teachings from the Quran and the practices of Islamic faith. The people of Mindanao, already accustomed to centuries of contact with foreign merchants, were open to hearing new ideas. To them, Islam was not a sudden revolution, but a new set of beliefs that could be compared, adapted, and integrated into their existing spiritual world. The first places touched by Islam were coastal settlements, particularly in the Sulu archipelago and western Mindanao. Here, trade already flourished, and local leaders were eager to establish stronger ties with Muslim traders who controlled vast networks stretching as far as India and the Middle East. The promise of belonging to this larger network was attractive. Islam brought not just a new religion, but also political legitimacy and access to broader alliances. Unlike the later colonial conquests of Spain, the spread of Islam in Mindanao during this early phase was peaceful and diplomatic. Missionaries married into local families, forming bonds of kinship that allowed Islam to take root. Over time, certain rituals, such as prayer, fasting, and the use of Arabic scripts and writing, began to merge with local traditions. This blending was the first step in transforming Mindanao's cultural and religious landscape, preparing it for the birth of new sultanates. For the Subanen and other inland communities, the arrival of Islam was both intriguing and challenging. Their animistic traditions, centered on spirits of nature and ancestral law, had guided their way of life for centuries. Now, a new faith was spreading across the coast, carried by traders who spoke of one God, written scriptures, and a global community of believers. Unlike Christianity, which would later attempt to erase indigenous practices, Islam in its early stages did not aggressively confront local traditions. Instead, it coexisted, allowing room for adaptation and negotiation. In coastal areas, some leaders welcomed Islam quickly. Conversion gave them access to new trade benefits, stronger political alliances, and prestige among their peers. For the Subanen, however, conversion was slower. Living inland, away from the bustling ports, they continued to rely on their old ways. Rituals for farming, peace pacts sealed with spiritual vows, and belief in Diwata Migbebaya. While they respected visiting missionaries, many Subanen communities chose to remain within their ancestral faith, seeing no reason to abandon a system that had kept them prosperous and united. Still, the Subanen were not isolated from the new religion. Through trade, marriage, and travel, they encountered Muslim practices. Some adopted Arabic loanwords. Others participated in trade rituals influenced by Islam, and a few even converted when settling in coastal regions. Yet for most, the 14th century was a period of cultural coexistence rather than conflict. They witnessed the beginnings of Islam's spread, but did not yet feel pressure to change their way of life. This coexistence is vital to understanding the history of Mindanao. Too often, history is written as if one faith suddenly replaced another. In reality, the process was gradual, layered, and filled with dialogue. Islam entered Mindanao as an additional thread in an already diverse tapestry of beliefs. For the Subanen, it was a neighboring force, sometimes embraced, sometimes resisted, but always acknowledged as part of the shifting world around them. The introduction of Islam in 1380 was not just about faith. It laid the groundwork for political transformation. As coastal leaders embraced the new religion, they began to reshape their identities and authority. By adopting Islam, they connected themselves to a global Muslim community, one that stretched from Arabia to Southeast Asia. This gave them new legitimacy in the eyes of both their people and foreign traders. Religious conversion became political power. In the years following Karim al-Maktoum's arrival, Communities in Sulu and parts of western Mindanao began to transition toward more centralized governance under Islamic influence. Local datas who converted could now claim divine sanction for their rule, reinforced by Islamic law and teachings. This was the first step toward the formation of the sultanates, powerful states that would soon dominate the political map of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. For inland groups like the Subanen, the rise of sultanates would bring new challenges. While they maintained autonomy in their mountain and river valleys, the growing influence of Islam on the coasts meant that power dynamics were shifting. Trade routes increasingly passed through Muslim-controlled ports, giving these new rulers greater leverage. Subanen leaders had to negotiate carefully, maintaining their independence while also engaging in trade and diplomacy with the emerging Islamic powers. This was the beginning of a new era. Islam had not yet swept across all of Mindanao, but its seeds had been firmly planted. The faith spread through kinship, trade, and diplomacy, reshaping coastal politics and slowly influencing cultural practices. By the end of the 14th century, Mindanao was no longer just a land of animistic rituals and trade networks. It was becoming part of the wider Muslim world. The next chapters of its history would be marked by the rise of sultanates, the strengthening of Muslim polities, and the continued dialogue between old and new traditions. By the 15th century, the seeds planted by early Muslim missionaries had begun to sprout into organized states. The coastal regions of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago transformed into centers of power rooted in Islam. Among these, the most prominent was the Sultanate of Sulu, which rose as a powerful maritime kingdom. Established through the blending of local leadership with Islamic governance, the Sultanate quickly gained influence across the seas, ruling not only over Sulu, but also claiming territories as far as Palawan, Sabah and Borneo, and parts of Basilan. Meanwhile, inland along the Pulangi River Basin, another great state was forming. Around the mid-15th century, Sharif Kabungswan, an Arab-Malay missionary and leader, arrived in Mindanao. He married into the local ruling family and introduced Islam to the Maguindanan people. Through this union of bloodline and faith, the Sultanate of Maguindanao was born. This sultanate became one of the most influential Muslim powers in the Philippines, holding sway over large portions of central and western Mindanao. The rise of these sultanates marked a dramatic shift. Leadership was no longer based purely on kinship or tribal law. It now carried the weight of religious authority. Sultans were not only political rulers, but also spiritual leaders, bound to uphold Islamic law and ensure the moral order of their people. The adoption of Islam strengthened their legitimacy in the eyes of foreign traders, linking them directly to the vast Muslim trading world of Southeast Asia. This transformation did not erase local culture. Instead, Islamic practices blended with indigenous traditions. Ritual dances, oral epics, and community laws persisted, but they were now intertwined with Islamic prayers, the use of Arabic script, and the recognition of Mecca as a spiritual center. The people of Mindanao were becoming part of something larger than themselves, a global community united by faith, trade, and diplomacy. As the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao grew in power, the Subanen people faced a new chapter in their long history. Their ancestral land stretched across the Zamboanga Peninsula, where they had built settlements, farms, and small trading hubs for centuries. Unlike the coastal Tazig and Maguindanan, however, the Subanen were not quick to embrace Islam. Their society remained deeply tied to Diwata Migbebaya and to rituals that honored the spirits of rivers, forests, and mountains. The Subanen monarchy in Zamboangan, while less centralized than the great sultanates, was no less important for their identity. They had their own leaders known as timues, who governed through councils and customary law. Trade continued to flourish, with Semboangan serving as a hub where Chinese ceramics, beads, and iron tools were exchanged for pearls, gold, and forest products. But as the Sultanate of Sulu expanded its influence along the seas and Maguindanao extended power inland, the Subanen found themselves navigating new political realities. Some Subanen communities entered into alliances with the sultanates, trading peacefully and acknowledging their growing power. Others resisted, clinging tightly to their autonomy and rejecting outside influence. Unlike the rapid Islamization of coastal areas, Subanen conversion was rare, and their distinct identity endured. This persistence highlights an important truth about Mindanao. It was never a monolithic society. Even during the rise of Islamic powers, the island remained home to diverse cultures, some embracing change, others guarding their ancient traditions. The Subanen story during this era reveals both resilience and adaptation. They were not isolated. They traded, negotiated, and sometimes fought with their neighbors. Yet they preserved their own cosmology and communal law, proving that the rise of the sultanates did not erase the presence of nomad tribes. Instead, Mindanao's history became a tapestry woven from both Islamic states and indigenous traditions, each shaping the destiny of the island in their own way. The 15th century was not only a time of religious transformation, it was also an age of thriving diplomacy and trade. The sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao positioned themselves as key players in the maritime world. Sulu, in particular, emerged as a powerful trading state, linking Mindanao with Borneo, Malacca, and even China. Chinese record from the Ming Dynasty mentioned trading missions from Sulu, where pearls, sea cucumbers, and precious woods were exchanged for silk, porcelain, and metal tools. The Maguindanao Sultanate, centered on the Pulangi River, developed into a land-based kingdom with a strong agricultural base. Its fertile floodplains supported rice farming, while its people mined gold and engaged in long-distance trade. By aligning with Muslim merchants, Maguindanao rulers secured firearms and new technologies, giving them military advantages over rival tribes. This combination of economic wealth and military strength made the Sultanate one of the most formidable powers in the Philippines. Diplomacy played a central role in their rise. Marriage alliances connected ruling families across islands, binding Sulu, Maguindanao, and even Brunei in webs of kinship and loyalty. These alliances ensured not only political stability, but also the smooth flow of trade across the seas. The adoption of Islam gave these rulers prestige in the eyes of foreign merchants, allowing them to claim equal standing with other Muslim leaders across the region. For the Subanen and other nomad groups, these developments were both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, trade with the sultanates brought prosperity, new goods, and cultural exchange. On the other, it shifted power dynamics, concentrating wealth and influence in the hands of the sultans. The inland tribes had to defend their independence carefully, balancing trade relations with the preservation of their sovereignty. By the end of the 15th century, Mindanao was no longer simply a land of scattered tribes. It had become home to sophisticated states whose power was recognized far beyond the Philippines. The rise of the sultanates set the stage for centuries of struggle against Spanish colonizers, against rival tribes, and eventually against new foreign powers. This era, defined by the birth of Islamic monarchies, marked Mindanao's entrance into the grand theater of regional politics and global trade. The 16th century was the age when the early seeds of Islamic kingdoms in Mindanao fully matured into powerful sultanates. By this period, Both the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao had firmly established themselves as dominant forces, shaping the political, cultural, and economic life of large swaths of the southern Philippines. Their rulers were no longer just local leaders. They had become monarchs with regional authority, commanding armies, enforcing Islamic law, and engaging in diplomacy with faraway kingdoms. The Sultanate of Sulu, under the rule of its early sultans, became one of the most prosperous maritime powers in the region. It extended influence beyond Sulu proper, laying claim to Basilan, Palawan, Tai, and even Sabah in northern Borneo. Sulu's strength came from its naval power. Its fleets controlled important sea routes, protecting merchant vessels and sometimes raiding rival territories. This mastery of the sea made Sulu a central node in Southeast Asian trade, linking Chinese, Malay, and Arab merchants. Meanwhile, the Sultanate of Maguindanao consolidated power inland. Its base along the Pulangi River allowed it to harness the agricultural richness of the region. The floodplains became rice baskets that supported large populations, while upland areas produced forest goods and gold. By the mid-16th century, the Maguindanan rulers were recognized as kings with divine sanction, respected both within their realm and by neighboring powers such as Brunei. The sultans held court with elaborate ceremonies, blending indigenous practices with Islamic rituals, symbolizing their dual identity as both traditional leaders and religious figures. This was also the century when foreign threats began to loom. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Visayas, bringing with him the first wave of Spanish Catholic influence. By mid-century, Spanish colonization efforts expanded and missionaries began targeting various islands. Yet in Mindanao, the sultanates stood resilient. Their Islamic faith and centralized power gave them the strength to resist colonization more effectively than other regions. This ability to defend themselves against foreign intrusion became one of the defining features of Mindanao's history. As the sultanates expanded their power, the Subanen people once again found themselves at the crossroads of change. The rise of Sulu and Maguindanao shifted the balance of power across Mindanao, but the Subanen, scattered across the Zamboanga Peninsula and northern Mindanao, remained committed to their traditional ways of life. While the coasts were increasingly dominated by Muslim rulers, the uplands remained bastions of indigenous traditions. The Subanen continued to honor their ancestral deity, Diwata Migbebaya, and the spirits of their natural environment. Rituals, dances, and oral traditions flourished, passed down through generations. Their leaders, the Timues, governed through consensus and communal law rather than absolute monarchy. Land was still regarded as communal property, belonging to the people as a shared resource. These customs stood in contrast to the growing power of the sultanates, where Islamic law was gradually replacing older traditions. Yet the Subanen were not isolated. Trade connected them to both Muslim and foreign merchants. They supplied forest products, rice, and gold in exchange for beads, ceramics, and iron tools. At times, they entered into peace pacts with the sultanates, agreeing to coexist while maintaining autonomy. At other times, they resisted incursions, especially when attempts were made to control their trade routes or force conversion. Their resistance was not only physical, but also cultural. By preserving their religion, language, and governance, the Subanen declared their right to exist outside the structures of the sultanates. This resistance set the stage for later centuries, when the Subanen would also confront Spanish colonizers. But in the 1500s, their struggle was primarily with neighboring Islamic powers. Unlike coastal peoples who embraced Islam, the Subanen chose to remain distinctly themselves, making their story an essential counterpoint to the narrative of Islam's spread. Their history proves that Mindanao was never fully unified under a single power or faith. It was a mosaic of diverse identities, sometimes cooperating, sometimes clashing, but always coexisting. The consolidation of the sultanates was not achieved through military power alone. It was equally the product of diplomacy and trade. The Sultanate of Sulu engaged in regular missions to the Ming dynasty in China, where they were treated with honor as sovereign rulers. These missions brought back valuable goods such as porcelain, silk, and gunpowder technology. At the same time, the sultans of Sulu cultivated alliances with Brunei and other Muslim states, ensuring that their kingdom was integrated into the regional Islamic network of Southeast Asia. The Sultanate of Maguindanao also benefited from these connections. Its rulers forged ties with Muslim traders who brought not only material goods, but also Islamic scholars and teachers. Through these networks, Arabic writing spread, and Islamic schools were established, deepening the faith of the local population. Diplomacy with Brunei provided legitimacy and security, allowing Maguindanao to thrive even in the face of Spanish intrusion. But not all relations were peaceful. The sultanates frequently engaged in maritime raids, targeting rival tribes and sometimes Visayan settlements. These raids were not merely acts of war, but part of the economic system, supplying slaves and wealth to sustain their kingdoms. Such practices made the sultanates feared as much as they were respected. The Subanen, caught between trade opportunities and the threat of raids, had to maintain constant vigilance. By the end of the 16th century, Mindanao had become a land of contrasts. On one side stood the powerful Islamic sultanates, firmly entrenched and connected to global trade. On the other side, inland tribes like the Subanen clung to their traditions, preserving an older way of life. The tension between these worlds created a dynamic society where identity was constantly negotiated and survival required both strength and adaptability. This delicate balance of power set the stage for the next century, when the arrival of Spain in full force would ignite conflicts that would last for generations. The dawn of the 17th century marked a turning point in the history of Mindanao. By this time, Spain had already consolidated its control over Luzon and much of the Visayas, spreading Christianity and building colonial outposts. Yet Mindanao, with its powerful sultanates and resilient indigenous groups, remained beyond Spanish grasp. The Spanish crown, determined to bring the entire archipelago under its rule, turned its attention southward. What followed was a century of conflict, negotiation, and resistance. In 1635, the Spanish constructed Fort Pilar in Zamboanga, a massive stone fortress designed to control the Zamboanga Peninsula and establish a stronghold against both Muslim and Lumad resistance. This fort was more than just a military base. It was also a symbol of Spain's ambition to Christianize and colonize the South. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits and Augustinians, followed the soldiers, seeking to convert the Subanen and other indigenous tribes of the region. But the Spanish soon discovered that Mindanao was not like the Visayas. The people here were not passive subjects waiting to be ruled. The Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao mounted fierce resistance, defending their autonomy with both diplomacy and warfare. The Spanish campaigns often resulted in bloody stalemates, with forts changing hands and villages being burned, only to be rebuilt by resilient locals. For the Subanen, the arrival of Spain added a new layer of complexity. They had already navigated relations with Muslim powers, sometimes allying, sometimes resisting. Now they faced a foreign empire seeking to impose both political control and a new religion. Many Subanen resisted conversion, retreating deeper into the uplands to preserve their customs. Yet others, weary of raids and wars, entered into fragile agreements with Spanish priests and soldiers. The century thus became one of constant tension, as Spain tried to impose its will while the people of Mindanao fought to maintain their freedom. Among the many groups who resisted Spanish intrusion, the Subanen people played a unique role. Their ancestral homeland, stretching across the Zamboanga Peninsula and northern Mindanao, placed them directly in the path of Spanish expansion. When Fort Pilar was established in Zamboanga, Spanish soldiers and missionaries began targeting Subanen communities for conversion, portraying them as pagans in need of salvation. But the Subanen were not willing to surrender their way of life so easily. The Timues, or traditional leaders, rallied their people to resist both military occupation and religious conversion. Subanen villages were often relocated deeper into mountains or forested valleys, making it difficult for Spanish forces to reach them. They employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids, and strategic retreats that allowed them to survive despite the overwhelming firepower of Spanish muskets and cannons. In this way, the Subanen preserved their autonomy even as coastal areas fell under greater Spanish influence. Their defense was not only physical, but cultural. The Subanen continued to honor Diwata Migbebaya and performed their rituals in secret when missionaries attempted to ban them. Their land laws, based on communal ownership, clashed with Spanish efforts to impose private property and tribute systems. Yet despite pressure, the Subanen maintained their traditions, ensuring that their cultural identity would endure for centuries. However, this resistance came at a cost. Subanen settlements near Spanish garrisons were often raided, their people enslaved or displaced. Some communities fled northward, establishing new settlements far from Spanish reach. Others entered into temporary truces, accepting baptism or trade agreements in exchange for peace. But these conversions were often superficial, adopted only for survival. Beneath the surface, Subanen culture and belief remained strong, quietly defying colonial authority. Despite Spain's efforts, the 1600s did not bring the full conquest of Mindanao. Instead, it was a century of unfinished wars and uneasy truces. The Spanish, with their forts and missions, claimed to represent the authority of the crown, but in reality, their control was limited to a few coastal enclaves. Beyond the walls of Fort Pilar and other garrisons, the sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao continued to thrive, while Lumad tribes like the Subanen maintained their independence in the interior. Spanish expansion was repeatedly challenged by maritime raids launched by Muslim fleets. Tazig and Magandanan warriors, skilled in naval warfare, struck at Spanish outposts and even raided Visayan villages, taking captives and reclaiming resources. These raids became a defining feature of the period, reinforcing the image of Mindanao as unconquerable. For the Subanen, this meant living between two powers. On one side, the Spanish sought to dominate through forts, conversion, and taxation. On the other, the sultanates defended their autonomy and projected influence over trade routes. The Subanen managed this precarious balance by playing one side against the other, trading with both, resisting both, and sometimes retreating into their ancestral highlands to avoid conflict altogether. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's dream of a fully colonized Mindanao remained unfulfilled. Fort Pilar still stood in Zamboanga, but it was more a defensive outpost than a symbol of conquest. The Subanen, though pressured and sometimes displaced, had preserved their traditions. The sultanates, though constantly at war, had maintained their sovereignty. The century revealed a key truth. Mindanao could not be subdued by brute force alone. Its people, bound by faith, culture, and ancestral ties, were far too resilient for that. The 18th century unfolded as yet another chapter of Spain's unfinished conquest in Mindanao. By this time, Spanish forces had been in the Philippines for nearly 200 years, and yet their grip on the south remained fragile at best. Fort Pilar and Zamboanga stood as their strongest outpost, but it was more of a defensive structure than a symbol of total authority. Beyond its walls, Mindanao continued to resist, adapt, and thrive in its own way. The sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao remained powerful, controlling trade routes and forming alliances that extended as far as Borneo and the Malay Peninsula. Their fleets of warships carried out maritime raids not only in Mindanao, but also across Visayan Islands, striking fear into coastal settlements under Spanish control. The Spanish crown considered these raids a direct challenge to its sovereignty. Thus, the 1700s were filled with repeated military campaigns aimed at subduing the sultanates and their allies. Yet most of these efforts ended in frustration. Spain's galleons and cannons were formidable, but Mindanao's warriors fought with determination, using their intimate knowledge of rivers, forests, and seas to outmaneuver larger armies. The Moro raids became legendary, not just as acts of warfare, but as symbols of resistance against colonial power. In the midst of these larger struggles, the Subanen continued to live within their ancestral lands in the Zamboanga Peninsula and parts of northern Mindanao. Spanish missionaries frequently attempted to draw them into Christianity, often labeling them as uncivilized or pagans. Yet the Subanen, guided by their Timues and spiritual leaders, maintained a cautious distance. When forced, some outwardly accepted baptism, but in secret, they continued to honor their rituals and worship Diwata Migbebaya. For them, survival meant balancing the overwhelming pressure from the Spanish with the equally strong influence of the sultanates. Their villages became living symbols of quiet resistance, where tradition endured in the face of empire. Throughout the 18th century, Subanen society demonstrated an extraordinary ability to adapt while preserving its identity. Spanish records often describe them as elusive mountain dwellers who resisted permanent settlement in lowland areas where colonial control was strongest. But this was not simply isolation, it was a deliberate strategy of preservation. By moving deeper into the highlands, the Subanen created distance from both Spanish missionaries and raiders from rival groups. Their settlements became sanctuaries of culture, where ancestral laws and customs continued without interference. The Timues, or leaders, played a central role in maintaining cohesion. They ensured that disputes were resolved through dialogue, and that communal land remained protected. Spanish attempts to impose tribute or private ownership clashed with these traditions. Yet the Subanen refused to surrender their collective way of life. Land for them was not a commodity, but a sacred inheritance from their ancestors, tied to rituals that honored the spirits of the forests, rivers, and mountains. Cultural resilience was also evident in the preservation of oral traditions. Subanen epics, chants, and dances carried stories of their origins and struggles, reinforcing identity from one generation to the next. Even when missionaries attempted to replace these with Christian teachings, the old stories remained alive in households and community gatherings. The Balins, or ritual specialists, continued to serve as mediators between the human and spiritual world, safeguarding the belief that harmony with nature was essential for survival. This resilience was not without struggle. Raids from coastal powers often disrupted their villages, forcing migration and occasional loss of life. Spanish expeditions also burned settlements when resistance flared. Yet, remarkably, the Subanen always rebuilt. Every displacement, became an opportunity to reaffirm their connection to the land. Their refusal to disappear or assimilate entirely was itself a form of resistance, quieter than the naval battles of the sultanates, but no less powerful. By the close of the century, the Subanen stood as one of the clearest examples of how indigenous peoples could withstand centuries of colonial pressure without losing the essence of who they were. By the late 1700s, Mindanao remained a region defined by resistance and contested authority. The Spanish crown had invested enormous resources into forts, garrisons, and missionary efforts. Yet its control was limited to pockets of territory. The sultanates still dominated trade and regional politics, especially in Sulu, where the sultanate maintained strong diplomatic ties with foreign powers such as the British and Dutch. These alliances allowed the Tazig and Maguindanan fleets to remain formidable opponents, continuing raids that disrupted Spanish plans of full conquest. For the Subanen and other Lumad groups, this meant navigating an increasingly complex political landscape. On one side were the Spanish, with their forts and priests. On the other were the Muslim sultanates, whose influence reached inland through trade and alliances. The Subanen often found themselves caught between these powers, but skillfully avoided complete subjugation by either. Their strategy of survival, balancing limited cooperation with firm cultural independence, ensured their continuity. The Spanish themselves began to recognize the difficulty of their mission. Despite occasional victories, they could not stamp out the resilience of Mindanao's people. Reports sent back to Manila and Madrid often described the South as restless and unruly, a place where conquest seemed always just out of reach. Even the establishment of stronger garrisons did little to change this reality. By the close of the 18th century, Spain's hold on Mindanao was more symbolic than actual. For the Subanen, the century ended much as it began, with determination to preserve their ancestral traditions, even as empires rose and clashed around them. Their story during this time is not one of dramatic battles, but of quiet continuity, a reminder that survival itself can be a powerful form of resistance. As the 19th century loomed, new challenges awaited, but the Subanen had already proven that no amount of outside pressure could erase their identity. The early 19th century brought a period of transformation in Mindanao, influenced by both global and regional shifts. While Spain continued to assert nominal control over the archipelago, the realities on the ground remained markedly different. The colonial government struggled to impose its authority beyond fortified outposts like Fort Pilar in Zamboanga and a few scattered settlements along the coast. Mindanao, with its dense forests, mountainous terrains, and resilient peoples, continued to resist full Spanish domination. In this era, the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao maintained strong regional power. Sulu, with its established maritime dominance, controlled vital sea lanes connecting the Philippines to Borneo, Malacca, and beyond. Its fleets not only defended territory, but also maintained extensive trade networks, exchanging pearls, gold, spices, and forest products for silk, porcelain, and other imported goods. Maguindanao, inland along the Pulangi River Basin, continued to consolidate agricultural and gold-based economies, ensuring political strength through wealth and control of strategic trade routes. The Subanen, as always, preserved their autonomy in the upland and riverine regions of Zamboanga and northern Mindanao. By 1800, Spanish colonial administrators recognized the difficulty of reaching these interior areas. While missionaries and soldiers occasionally ventured into Subanen territories, the dense forests, combined with the Subanen's knowledge of the land, made sustained occupation virtually impossible. The Subanen continued to observe their traditional animistic beliefs, honoring Diwata Migbebaya and the spirits of mountains, rivers, and forests. Communal land practices remained intact, serving both as economic support and cultural identity markers. Trade remained a central factor in interactions between the Subanen, sultanates, and Spanish authorities. Subanen communities supplied rice, forest products, and gold to coastal markets in exchange for metal tools, beads, and ceramics. These exchanges were not purely economic. They were also social and political, strengthening relationships and establishing networks of mutual dependence. Even as Spain attempted to impose its rule, it had to rely on negotiation and cooperation with local leaders, both Muslim and non-Muslim. This delicate balance defined the political landscape of early 19th century Mindanao. The Subanen of the early 19th century had developed a highly adaptive and resilient society. Villages were strategically placed along rivers and highlands, providing access to fertile lands while offering protection from raids and colonial intrusion. Leadership was still vested in the Timue, whose authority was grounded in respect, wisdom, and mediation skills. These leaders ensured that disputes were resolved through consensus and ritual, maintaining social cohesion even under external pressure. Cultural and spiritual practices flourished. Festivals and rituals celebrated the cycles of planting and harvesting, as well as rites of passage such as birth, marriage, and death. The Subanen maintained a deep connection to the natural world, believing that harmony with nature was essential for prosperity and survival. Spiritual specialists, or Balins, guided these rituals, invoking the blessings of Diwata Migbebaya and other spirits to ensure fertility, health, and protection against calamities. Despite pressures from Spanish missionaries and the growing influence of nearby sultanates, the Subanen resisted forced conversion. While some individuals may have temporarily adopted Catholic practices, the community as a whole maintained continuity with their ancestral religion. Oral tradition remained the primary vehicle for transmitting history, moral codes, and cultural knowledge. Epics, chants, and myths told of the creation of the land, the deeds of ancestors, and the importance of communal solidarity. This continuity ensured that the Subanen identity remained distinct, even as the surrounding political and religious landscape evolved. Economically, the Subanen continued to thrive through a combination of farming, fishing, hunting, and small-scale gold mining. Communal ownership of land ensured equitable distribution of resources, reinforcing social cohesion and preventing large inequalities. Trade with neighboring sultanates and Chinese merchants also provided access to valuable goods, from metal implements to luxury items like beads and porcelain. These exchanges strengthened ties while maintaining autonomy, exemplifying the Subanen's ability to navigate complex political and economic landscapes without losing their cultural integrity. During the first half of the 19th century, Mindanao was a hub of overlapping influences. The Spanish maintained their coastal enclaves, attempting to project power inland, while Muslim sultanates held control over trade, law, and governance in larger territories. The Subanen remained autonomous, maintaining cultural continuity and economic resilience. Yet external pressures were increasing. Global trade networks brought new technologies and goods into Mindanao. Firearms, metal tools, textiles, and luxury items became more widely available, often through merchants operating in Sulu and Maguindanao ports. The introduction of these items altered local economies and social hierarchies. Leaders who could secure these goods gained influence, reinforcing the Sultanate's power while creating incentives for trade with coastal Subanen communities. Spanish influence, though limited, remained significant in some areas. Missionaries established churches and schools, and Spanish garrisons attempted to control strategic routes. These efforts led to localized conflicts and occasional skirmishes, particularly along the Zamboanga Peninsula. The Subanen skillfully avoided direct confrontation, often relocating temporarily or negotiating with both sides. Their strategy was one of cautious engagement, participating in trade and diplomacy when beneficial, resisting domination when necessary, and preserving cultural and spiritual autonomy at all costs. By mid-century, the map of Mindanao reflected these overlapping spheres of influence. The coastal sultanates were thriving political entities, partially resistant to Spanish intrusion. Inland and highland areas, dominated by nomad groups like the Subanen, remained bastions of traditional culture and governance. This balance of autonomy and interaction defined the first half of the 19th century, setting the stage for later encounters with more intensive colonial expansion and socio-political changes in the latter half of the century. By the mid-19th century, Spanish control in Mindanao had entered a phase of decline, though the Crown maintained forts along the coasts, including the long-standing Fort Pilar in Zamboanga. Its reach remained largely symbolic. Inland and upland regions, home to the Subanen, Mandaya, Manobo, and other nomad groups, were effectively beyond colonial administration. Spanish officials often refer to these areas as unreachable or unpacified, a testament to the enduring autonomy of indigenous communities. The sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao, meanwhile, continued to exercise significant power. Sulu's maritime dominance allowed it to maintain trade networks linking the Philippines to Borneo, Malacca, and even as far as Java and China. Maguindanao controlled the fertile Pulangi River basin, with agriculture, gold mining, and strategic river routes consolidating its authority. These sultanates also became intermediaries in global trade, supplying local products in exchange for firearms, textiles, and porcelain, which strengthened their political and military positions. For the Subanen, Spanish decline was both a challenge and an opportunity. They remained largely autonomous, retaining ancestral lands and cultural practices, yet the weakening Spanish presence also meant increasing pressure from neighboring sultanates and commercial interests. Subanen villages engaged in trade with Muslim rulers and Chinese merchants, exchanging gold, forest products, and agricultural surplus for imported goods. Their ability to navigate this environment required careful diplomacy, ensuring that they maintained independence while benefiting from regional commerce. Spanish missionaries, particularly Jesuits and Recollects, attempted to expand Christianity into Subanen territories during this period. Schools, churches, and small garrisons were established in accessible areas, but their influence remained limited. Most Subanen communities retained traditional animistic practices, worshiping Diwata Migbebaya and honoring rivers, mountains, and forests. Resistance to conversion was reinforced by the strong authority of the Timues, who enforced communal law and upheld cultural rituals. Throughout the late 19th century, Subanen society continued to demonstrate remarkable resilience. Social cohesion was maintained through the leadership of Timues and village councils, which oversaw land management, dispute resolution, and ritual practices. Communal land tenure ensured that resources were shared equitably, preventing wealth concentration and preserving social harmony. These practices contrasted sharply with Spanish attempts to impose private property systems and tribute obligations. The Subanen economy remained based on a combination of agriculture, fishing, hunting, and small-scale gold mining. Rice, corn, and root crops formed the staples of their diet, while rivers and coastal zones provided fish and freshwater resources. Gold mining, though small in scale, was a critical aspect of their trade with coastal settlements and Chinese merchants. Semboangan, Samboanga City, continued to function as a hub for Subanen commerce, connecting inland communities with regional markets. Cultural practices flourished in tandem with economic life. Festivals, rites of passage, and seasonal ceremonies celebrated both the agricultural calendar and the spiritual world. Balins, ritual specialists, continued to guide spiritual activities, invoking Diwata Migbebaya and other spirits to protect crops, ensure community health, and maintain harmony with the natural world. Oral histories preserve knowledge of ancestry, migration, and resistance, ensuring that younger generations understood both their lineage and the importance of cultural continuity. Despite Spanish encroachment, the Subanen retained their autonomy through careful navigation of political and economic networks. They negotiated trade, paid tribute selectively when required, and retreated strategically when military pressures became overwhelming. Their approach reflected both resilience and adaptability, allowing them to survive centuries of external threats without losing their cultural identity. The closing decades of the 19th century saw major shifts in the global and regional political landscape. Spain's weakening authority culminated in the Philippine Revolution, 1896 to 1898, challenging colonial power across the archipelago. While much of the revolution centered in Luzon and the Visayas, Mindanao was not immune to its effects. Spanish garrisons faced increased instability, local uprisings, and pressures from sultanates defending territorial integrity. The Treaty of Paris, 1898, formally ended the Spanish-American War, transferring control of the Philippines to the United States. For Mindanao, this marked a profound shift. Spanish forces withdrew, and American colonial administrators began asserting authority. Initially, their reach was limited to coastal enclaves, much like the Spanish before them. But the technological and military advantages of the Americans hinted at future pressures on the autonomy of sultanates and indigenous communities. For the Subanen, the transition to American rule introduced new uncertainties. The U.S. did not immediately interfere with inland communities, but surveys, censuses, and occasional expeditions began mapping Subanen lands. While initial contact was limited, these interventions foreshadowed the eventual incorporation of Subanen territories into a national framework. The community's leaders recognized the importance of negotiation, diplomacy, and cautious engagement to protect autonomy. Trade and social networks continued to function as before, linking Subanen villages with Chinese merchants, coastal sultanates, and nearby Spanish enclaves still transitioning under American control. Cultural practices persisted, maintaining continuity in the face of shifting political authorities. By 1898, Subanen society demonstrated centuries of endurance. They had survived Islamic expansion, Spanish colonization, and were now entering the complex world of American colonial administration, all while maintaining identity, governance, and a profound connection to ancestral lands. Following the Treaty of Paris in 1898, the Philippines officially came under American sovereignty, signaling the end of Spanish rule and the beginning of a new colonial period. In Mindanao, the initial impact of American authority was gradual, especially in the upland and riverine territories inhabited by the Subanen. While coastal towns such as Samboanga, Davao, and Cagayan de Oro experienced direct American oversight through garrisons, schools, and administrative centers, the remote Subanen villages retained a significant degree of autonomy. The Americans focused initially on stabilizing major population centers and pacifying coastal sultanates, understood the difficulty of exerting control over dense forests and mountainous terrain. Despite this, The presence of the Americans introduced new forms of governance and socio-political structures. The U.S. administration established local municipal governments, introduced census taking, and attempted to map ancestral lands for taxation and resource management purposes. Subanen leaders, particularly the Timues, were cautious yet strategic in dealing with these new authorities. They engaged in selective diplomacy, agreeing to cooperate in trade or minor administrative matters, while continuing to exercise control over their villages and traditional lands. This careful balance was essential to preserving Subanen identity in the face of rapidly changing political circumstances. Economic and social life during this period also began to shift, influenced by American trade and technological imports. Roads, rudimentary bridges, and supply routes started to appear near lowland Subanen settlements, connecting them indirectly to coastal towns and markets. Chinese and Filipino traders increasingly penetrated inland communities, providing metal tools, textiles, and imported goods in exchange for forest products, agricultural produce, and gold. Subanen society, already adept at negotiating with sultanates and Spanish authorities, applied similar strategies to navigate American influence. This period laid the groundwork for the community's adaptation to the changing socio-political landscape of the early 20th century. Even under the emerging presence of the Americans, the Subanen retained their cultural and spiritual autonomy. Rituals led by Balins continued to guide agricultural cycles, healing practices, and rites of passage. Ancestral narratives, epics, and oral histories remained central to community life, ensuring intergenerational transmission of identity and social values. The Subanen also continued to hold their lands communally, resisting American attempts to formalize private property, which they viewed as incompatible with their social norms and belief systems. Leadership structures remained anchored in the authority of the Timues, who mediated disputes, coordinated communal work, and led negotiations with external powers. Social cohesion was maintained through ritual, collective labor, and respect for elders, enabling Subanen communities to survive external pressures while preserving internal harmony. These practices were particularly crucial as American administrators occasionally attempted to introduce Western education, religious conversion, and taxation in Subanen areas. While some families may have adopted minimal American practices for survival or convenience, most villages maintained their traditional way of life. The early 20th century also saw shifting dynamics with neighboring Muslim and Lumad groups. The sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao, although weakened by centuries of Spanish and American incursions, remained influential in the southern coastal and riverine regions. Subanen communities maintained trade and diplomatic relations with these sultanates, supplying inland goods while respecting maritime authority where necessary. These interactions reinforced regional stability and allowed Subanen villages to remain relatively insulated from direct American interference. Meanwhile, internal pressures such as migration and population growth required careful management. Subanen communities periodically relocated along rivers or into upland areas to maintain access to fertile land and water resources, a practice consistent with centuries of adaptive settlement patterns. Communal land tenure continued to regulate access, ensuring that conflicts were minimized and resources shared equitably. This internal cohesion was essential in maintaining independence, particularly as American officials began mapping the region and establishing nominal jurisdiction over previously autonomous areas. Education and religion slowly made inroads, but often on terms negotiated by local leaders. Missionaries and American teachers sometimes introduced literacy and practical skills without fully disrupting traditional structures. The Subanen selectively adopted new knowledge, integrating it into their existing practices rather than allowing wholesale cultural replacement. By 1920, Subanen society demonstrated remarkable continuity. Politically autonomous, economically adaptive, and culturally resilient, the community had successfully negotiated over 2 decades of American colonial presence while preserving its ancestral identity, social systems, and spiritual traditions. The period from 1920 to 1945 in Mindanao represented a transition from autonomous regional rule toward integration into a modern Philippine state under American oversight. After more than 2 decades of initial American administration, infrastructure development, education reforms, and bureaucratic systems expanded gradually into Mindanao. Coastal towns like Zamboanga, Cagayan de Oro, and Davao became hubs of American influence, with schools, military installations, and government offices increasingly regulating economic and political life. However, interior regions, particularly those inhabited by the Subanen, retained a considerable degree of autonomy, owing to their geographic isolation, social cohesion, and cultural resilience. The Subanen were aware that the political landscape around them was shifting. The American administration encouraged the incorporation of local leaders into formal governance structures, offering recognition, stipends, or advisory roles. Some TIMUAs strategically engaged with a new system, participating in municipal councils or providing logistical support for infrastructure projects, yet they did so without surrendering traditional authority over land, customs, or dispute resolution. This dual approach allowed the Subanen to negotiate for resources and political legitimacy while preserving internal social and cultural autonomy. At the same time, the sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao, though weakened, remained influential, particularly in coastal and riverine areas. Their authority was based not only on historical sovereignty, but also on control of trade, alliances, and armed forces. They occasionally coordinated with American authorities when mutual interests aligned, yet conflicts over taxation, jurisdiction, and territorial boundaries persisted. For the Subanen, these dynamics required careful diplomacy, balancing engagement with both sultanates and the colonial state. Trade, tribute, and ceremonial relationships were used as tools to maintain independence while benefiting from new economic opportunities. During this period, Subanen society demonstrated remarkable resilience in maintaining cultural practices despite mounting external pressures. Rituals led by Balins continued to be central to agricultural cycles, community health, and rites of passage. Seasonal ceremonies, feasts, and storytelling reinforced intergenerational transmission of knowledge, ensuring that younger generations understood the values, ethics, and traditions of the community. Even as American educators attempted to introduce Western curricula, literacy, and Christian religious education, most Subanen villages continued their traditional practices alongside these new systems, blending selective innovations with enduring customs. Economically, the Subanen continued to rely on a combination of farming, fishing, hunting, and gold mining. Communal land tenure remained central to village life, preventing inequitable resource accumulation and fostering cooperation. Agricultural cycles were attuned to the rhythms of local rivers, upland fields, and forested zones. Trade networks expanded slightly, with Chinese and Filipino merchants increasingly reaching inland communities, providing metal tools, textiles, and household goods in exchange for rice, corn, forest products, and gold. These transactions were integrated into social relationships, reinforcing alliances, obligations, and prestige within and between villages. The Subanen also demonstrated adaptive strategies to protect their land and resources. Villages were often relocated to respond to environmental conditions, population pressures, or external threats. Through communal decision-making, the Timues ensured equitable access to water, agricultural land, and hunting areas. This system maintained social cohesion while resisting pressures from both neighboring Muslim authorities and the expanding American bureaucracy. Cultural continuity and economic stability were mutually reinforcing, demonstrating the Subanen's capacity to adapt to a rapidly changing world without losing their distinct identity. The 1930s and 1940s introduced additional layers of complexity for Mindanao and the Subanen. The rise of Filipino nationalism and preparations for independence from the United States meant that even distant upland communities became subject to broader political narratives. Infrastructure projects, census taking, and military surveys increasingly penetrated traditional territories, while nationalist ideologies began to influence policy and education. Subanen leaders responded cautiously, ensuring that their communities were included in the administrative framework without compromising traditional authority. World War II brought unprecedented disruption. Japanese occupation of the Philippines from 1942 to 1945 reached Mindanao, with military campaigns affecting both coastal and interior regions. The Subanen, like other indigenous groups, faced forced labor, resource requisitions, and occasional violence. Nevertheless, their knowledge of terrain, coupled with cohesive social structures, enabled many communities to resist complete domination. Subanen villages provided refuge for displaced populations, coordinated local defense, and maintained food production to sustain survival in wartime conditions. Trade, ritual, and social cohesion persisted, even under occupation. The Balans continued to lead spiritual practices, reinforcing resilience and morale. Economic networks adapted to wartime constraints, with communities exchanging surplus food, forest products, and small-scale gold mining outputs with neighboring groups to ensure survival. By the end of the war in 1945, the Subanen had once again demonstrated their capacity to endure and adapt, preserving cultural integrity, communal land practices, and social cohesion through decades of colonial pressure, political change, and global conflict. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 left the Philippines devastated, and Mindanao was no exception. Coastal cities, including Zamboanga, Davao, and Cagayan de Oro, experienced damage from Japanese occupation and subsequent liberation campaigns. However, the Subanen, residing primarily in upland regions and along river valleys, were spared much of the direct destruction. Their geographic isolation and resilient social structures allowed them to rebuild and maintain continuity in the immediate post-war years. American forces, returning briefly to assist in post-war reconstruction, emphasized infrastructure development, healthcare, and education in urban and accessible rural areas. Roads and bridges gradually extended into lower Subanen territories, connecting inland villages with regional markets. This expansion brought both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, trade increased, enabling Subanen communities to access tools, textiles, and other manufactured goods. On the other hand, the arrival of government officials, military personnel, and missionaries introduced pressures to adopt external administrative and religious systems. The Philippine government, preparing for full independence, granted in 1946, also began integrating Mindanao into the national administrative framework. Municipal boundaries were defined, censuses conducted, and formal land titles introduced. Subanen leaders, particularly the Timues, strategically navigated these changes. They engaged with municipal authorities, often acting as intermediaries between the state and their communities, while continuing to enforce traditional land laws and social practices internally. This dual approach preserved autonomy while allowing for cautious adaptation to a new national order. During the post-war Reconstruction period, Subanen communities focused on restoring and expanding their economic foundations. Agriculture, particularly rice, corn, and root crops, remained central to village life, complemented by fishing along rivers and coastal zones and small-scale gold mining. Communal land tenure ensured equitable access to resources, sustaining social cohesion while supporting trade networks with nearby municipalities and Chinese merchants. Cultural practices flourished alongside economic resilience. Valens continued to lead spiritual rituals tied to agricultural cycles, health, and community well-being. Oral traditions were actively preserved, ensuring that younger generations inherited knowledge of Subanen history, ethics, and cosmology. Seasonal festivals and rites of passage reinforced identity, providing continuity even as national policies and foreign influences encroached. Education gradually became more accessible, though selectively adopted by Subanen communities. While American established public schools promoted literacy and a national curriculum, many Subanen families chose to blend formal education with traditional teachings. This approach allowed them to acquire practical skills and broader societal knowledge without sacrificing cultural heritage. Similarly, exposure to Christianity was often negotiated. Some families adopted certain practices for social or economic convenience, while the community as a whole maintained ancestral animistic beliefs, honoring Diwata Migbebaya and natural spirits in forests, rivers, and mountains that by the 1960s. Subanen society had achieved a careful balance between engagement with the emerging Philippine nation and preservation of internal autonomy. Their leadership structures, social norms, and spiritual practices remained largely intact, illustrating resilience and strategic adaptation in the face of rapid socio-political change. The period from 1950 to 1970 brought additional political and social pressures. National development policies, land reform initiatives, and migration programs encouraged settlement in Mindanao by people from Luzon and the Visayas. These programs often encroached on Subanen ancestral lands, creating tension over resources, territorial rights, and governance. Despite these pressures, the Timues and community councils maintained effective local authority, mediating disputes and protecting communal land practices. Trade and economic adaptation remained crucial. Subanen communities engaged with migrant farmers, coastal merchants, and regional markets, exchanging agricultural products, forest resources, and gold. These economic interactions were integrated into social and political strategies, ensuring the community maintained both wealth and autonomy. Subanen settlements also remained strategically mobile, relocating when necessary to preserve access to fertile land, water resources, and defensive positions. Culturally, the Subanen reinforced continuity through ritual, oral tradition, and intergenerational teaching. Festivals, ceremonies, and spiritual observances remained central, ensuring cohesion and reinforcing values such as communal responsibility, respect for elders, and harmony with the natural environment. By 1970, Subanen society exemplified a model of resilience. Despite external pressures from national integration, migration, and policy changes, their social structures, spiritual practices, and economic systems persisted largely intact, securing both autonomy and identity for future generations. From the 1970s onward, Mindanao faced a period of profound socio-political transformation, marked by both national development initiatives and localized conflicts. The Philippine government intensified efforts to integrate Mindanao into the national framework through infrastructure development, settlement programs, and administrative reforms. Roads, Bridges, schools, and government offices extended into previously remote regions, including areas inhabited by the Subanen. These initiatives aim to stimulate economic growth, increase state presence, and incorporate indigenous communities into broader national systems. However, these programs were not without challenges. Land settlement and agrarian reform schemes often encroached on Subanen ancestral territories, leading to disputes with migrant settlers from Luzon and Visayas. The influx of new populations sometimes resulted in resource competition, prompting local leaders to negotiate or resist encroachments to protect communal land systems. Timues and village councils continued to play a crucial role, mediating conflicts, asserting territorial rights, and ensuring that traditional practices were respected in the face of external pressures. Simultaneously, Mindanao experienced a rise in ethno-religious conflicts, particularly involving Muslim communities in the south. While the Subanen remained primarily non-Muslim, these regional tensions indirectly affected their villages, influencing trade, migration, and security strategies. Subanen communities navigated these challenges carefully, prioritizing the protection of their lands, social cohesion, and cultural autonomy. Their historical experience of balancing external pressures, Spanish, American, and national authorities, enabled them to respond strategically to contemporary political dynamics without compromising identity. Economically, the Subanen have continued to maintain a mixed subsistence and market-oriented system. Farming remains central, with rice, corn, root crops, and vegetables providing sustenance and local trade goods. Fishing along rivers, small-scale gold mining, and forest product collection supplement agricultural activities. Trade has expanded beyond local markets, facilitated by improved roads and regional economic integration. Subanen communities now engage with Filipino and Chinese merchants, municipal markets, and sometimes even international supply chains for specialty forest products or artisanal goods. Cultural continuity remains a hallmark of Subanen society. Rituals led by Balins continue to guide agricultural and social life, and spiritual reverence for Diwata Migbebaya and natural elements remain strong. Oral tradition is preserved through storytelling, song, and performance, ensuring that younger generations inherit ancestral knowledge, ethical frameworks, and historical consciousness. Festivals and seasonal ceremonies not only reinforce social cohesion, but also serve as platforms for intergenerational education, teaching values of communal responsibility, respect for elders, and environmental stewardship. Education and selective modernization have also been incorporated into Subanen society. Schools in nearby towns and government educational programs provide literacy, numeracy, and vocational skills, allowing youth to navigate both traditional life and contemporary economic opportunities. Some families blend Western education with indigenous practices, resulting in a hybrid model of cultural preservation and modern competence. This adaptability reflects the Subanen's long-standing ability to engage with external forces strategically, preserving autonomy and identity while participating in broader societal systems. Today, the Subanen continue to assert their presence and rights in Mindanao through both traditional governance and engagement with national institutions. Timues and village councils play active roles in decision-making, particularly regarding land use, resource management, and dispute resolution. Communal land tenure remains central, protecting agricultural plots, fishing zones, and forested areas critical to the community's survival and cultural identity. Legal recognition of ancestral domains under Philippine law has further strengthened their capacity to resist encroachment and defend territorial sovereignty. Environmental stewardship is an integral part of contemporary Subanen life. Their traditional understanding of harmony with rivers, mountains, and forests informs sustainable practices in farming, fishing, and resource collection. Community rituals often include elements of environmental protection, reinforcing ecological awareness alongside spiritual devotion. This long-standing relationship with the land not only ensures subsistence, but also positions the Subanen as custodians of biodiversity in Mindanao, preserving ecosystems that have sustained human and ecological communities for centuries. In the 21st century, Subanen society exemplifies resilience, continuity, and adaptability. Despite centuries of external pressures, from Islamic expansion, Spanish colonization, American rule, and national integration, the Subanen have preserved their language, governance, economic systems, and spiritual traditions. Their history underscores the rich diversity of Mindanao, revealing that the island's roots are deeply indigenous, with multiple tribes shaping its social, cultural, and ecological landscape. Today, the Subanen continue to balance tradition with modernity, ensuring that their ancestral heritage informs their participation in the national and global community while preserving identity, autonomy, and environmental stewardship for future generations. And that concludes our incredible journey through the history of Mindanao, brought to you by History Teller YT. Today, we've traversed thousands of years from the earliest Subanen settlements along river valleys and highlands, through the rise of regional kingdoms, the arrival of Islam and Christianity, colonial encounters with Spain and the United States, post-war reconstruction, and the ongoing resilience and adaptation of the Subanen people in the modern era. You've seen how they maintain their culture, governance, economic systems, and spiritual traditions, all while navigating foreign powers, migration pressures, and social change. The moral of today's story is clear. True resilience comes not only from survival, but from the ability to adapt while preserving identity, culture, and values. The Subanen teach us that honoring ancestral wisdom, maintaining strong communal bonds, and respecting the natural environment are not relics of the past. They are lessons for the present and guidance for the future. Their journey reminds us that history is not only written by rulers and conquerors, but also by those who safeguard their land, culture, and communities through perseverance, wisdom, and unity. As we conclude, we invite you to reflect on the layers of Mindanao's past and appreciate the depth of its cultural mosaic. If today's journey inspired you, remember that this channel, History Teller YT, is your home for uncovering hidden stories, exploring forgotten civilizations, and learning from the past to understand the present. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected for more epic explorations of history. We promise to bring you untold tales, forgotten legends, and deep dives into cultures that shaped the Philippines and beyond. Join us again for more stories that will take you across centuries, from ancient civilizations to modern communities, highlighting the richness, resilience, and diversity of human history. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive, honor the lessons of the past, and let the stories of our ancestors inspire you to explore, learn, and grow. Remember, every story matters, every culture has a voice, and here on History Teller YT, we ensure those voices are heard. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next journey through history. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring the rich tapestry of our shared past.